Hey, welcome back to the Blue Faith Podcast. And if you guys stuck it out for Revealing Revelation, I'm really glad that you came back for this study. You're going to find that Amir Tsarfati's book on discovering Daniel is a really great fit for Revelation, after Revelation, before Revelation, and that both of these books shed light on each other. And I have to start kind of at the beginning for context to understand what Daniel's facing and why God allowed the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, Daniel's a great example of how you treat your foes, how you maintain your faith when it would be easy not to, and ultimately how you hang on to hope and trust in God in the midst of trial and adversity. Now, if you walk through the books of Genesis and Exodus, and this is kind of how I'm going to set this up, you'll see the tribes of Israel meeting their God face to face. And you see this take place with Moses at Mount Sinai, and they enter into a covenant. You'll hear it throughout the Bible. It's the law of Moses, it's the Mosaic covenant. And what's interesting about this covenant that was different from the covenant with Abraham is that it's bilateral. And as you walk through the Old Testament, you'll find that God is faithful to his end of the bargain, but that Israel fails miserably on keeping their end of the bargain. Now, as a nation, they would chase after and worship other gods. They would intermarry with pagans. And at times they would completely forget that they even had a God that had pulled them out of the bondage of Egypt. Now, Daniel is but one of several prophets that God was revealing his plan for the nation of Israel and for the rest of the world. I mean, you've got tons of them. Some of the major prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. But because of Israel's rejection of their God and worship of pagan gods, and because they failed to keep the land Sabbath, which you read about in Jeremiah, every seventh year, they are taken into captivity by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's plan for the nation he would overthrow was to take the youngest and the brightest of the nation of Israel and indoctrinate them with the Babylonian lifestyle. In all fairness, I mean, they were innocent victims of the sins of their father. And it would have been easy for these guys and understandable for them to play the victims. Most of these guys came from most likely the tribe of Judah. They were all in the king's lineage. And he was taking them, mainly to keep them from ever coming back up against him. But here's what you'll find instead. You'll find that Daniel and his friends will choose a different path of hope, faith, and the way of their gods. Now, I'm going to start in Daniel 1 through 2. And in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Now, if you read through Amir's book, he titles this part of chapter 1, The Death March to Babylon. And there's no idea what that journey from Israel to Babylon was like. But Daniel and his friends knew that Babylon was most likely where they were going to stay. Now, just for historical reference, the Babylonians invaded Judah somewhere between September 606 BC to October 605 BC. Now, as we're reading this, I mean, this is literally more than 2,500 years ago. And outside of Egypt, Nebuchadnezzar was the first of great monarchs to be mentioned from ancient times. Now, there are campaigns mentioned by the Babylonian priest historian Berossus involving Egypt, Syria, Israel, and Phoenicia. Now, Jehoiakim had been placed on the throne of Judah by Pharaoh Necho himself. And after Nebuchadnezzar had vanquished Egypt, the land of Palestine made sense because of the coalition. Now, the term for God in this particular verses is not Yahweh here, but Adonai, which means owner or ruler or sovereign. Now, God was not asleep when the Babylonians invaded Judah, but instead it says here that Adonai, the sovereign ruler of Israel, gave King Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar. In verses 3 through 7, then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provisions of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now, from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them, the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, not all of the children from Judah were transported to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar instructed Ashpenaz, bring the good-looking, unblemished young men. Now, not just any men. These young men were most likely from the lineage of the royal family of Judah. They're from the line of the kings, and basically removing future kings from Judah, disrupting the Judean court and the government, causing a weakened nation. What's interesting is if you read through Isaiah, it's a fulfillment, direct fulfillment of Isaiah 39, 5 through 7. That reads like this. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the words of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Now, this prophecy predated the siege of Judah by 100 years. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's plan was to take the best, the brightest of Judah and make them the best, the brightest of Babylon. Now, they were allowed to worship their God from Israel, but not above or over the gods of Babylon. But they were not allowed to procreate. I mean, if you're not really familiar with the idea of a eunuch, their genitals would have been mutilated so that they could not father children. Now, outside of these minor setbacks, these young men were to be fed like kings. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to reprogram them to be of use to him in a 3-year training regimen. He didn't want them to grow up and plot against him, as happens in so many of the biblical stories amongst the kings. And to facilitate the assimilation into Babylonian culture, he gave them Babylonian names. Now, Daniel became Belteshazzar, Hananiah becomes Shadrach, Mishael becomes Meshach, and Azariah becomes Abednego. Now, the gods of Babylon included these. Marduk, which was the chief god of Babylon. He was the protector of the city. He was also known as Bel, which in Hebrew is Baal. His son Nebu, god of wisdom and literature, is where you get Mount Nebo. Moses' vantage point of the promised land bears the name of this god. And then finally, Aku, the moon god. Now, names had meanings back in ancient time. Now, Daniel in Hebrew meant God is my judge. But his name from Babylon is Belteshazzar, which means Bel, protect the prince. Hananiah in Hebrew, Yahweh has acted graciously, but in Babylon, Shadrach meant to worship creation or the command of Aku. Mishael meant in Hebrew, who is like God, but Meshach in Babylonian meant who is like Aku. Azariah meant Yahweh has helped, but Abednego meant servant of Nabu. So they're moving them from Judah to Babylon, mutilating their genitals, give them a king portion of food, changing their names, work to separate them from their Jewish past. And that's what you're going to see through the book of Daniel, that he uses as pattern. Daniel's whose name was Belteshazzar, but we aren't reading the book of Belteshazzar. We're reading the book of Daniel. In verse 8, it says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacy, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, Babylonian food did not meet the requirements set out by God for his people, and there were things that they could not eat. They could have steak, but they could not eat lobster, and they were forbidden to eat anything that had been sacrificed to idols or false gods. It is the first of many stands that these young men will take. In verses 9 through 14, it says, now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacy. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he considered with them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. You know, it's an interesting thing. The steward hesitated, genuinely afraid for his life, and he's given a charge from King Nebuchadnezzar himself. And if anything went sideways, he knew that it would be his head. Now, it's a small test for the steward. Let us eat vegetables and drink water for 10 days. And if our appearance suffers because of this diet, then you can deal with this as you see fit. He's saying, look, we'll go back. We'll do what you've asked us to do. Now, here's the thing, and kind of a biblical lesson for us. Trials and tribulations are not fun or easy, but according to the entirety of Scripture, we are promised to have them. In fact, Jesus himself said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome this world. Now, if we persevere, God will be with us and our character will increase. Now, these young men had every right to be bitter, but they weren't. And after 10 days, steward returns to examine for himself how this experiment has turned out. Now, he probably had a cart full of surf and turf to get the young men back to health. But in verse 15, we read, and at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Now, I think many of you probably would agree with me. I definitely do not want to be a vegetarian. And I don't subscribe to the health benefits such a diet might bring. Now, whether the diet was sufficient or God blessed them for their faith and obedience, I don't know. But after 10 days, their appearance was better and fatter in flesh than their peers who were eating the king's delicacies. They looked so good, the rest of the young men under his care had their portion of delicacies and wine taken away and were also given vegetables. Now, I'm not sure how popular these guys would have been with the rest of the young men in their Babylonian training program who went from eating like kings to eating like rabbits. Because of their obedience, though, God will bless these four more than all the rest. In verse 17, it says, as for these four young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all vision and dreams. Now, at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So, and bottom line is, these four blew the Babylonian training program out of the water. They were the teacher's pets. They outshined the rest of their peers and were far wiser than any of the seasoned wise men in the kingdom. They had reaped what they had sown. They were faithful in their actions, and their God was faithful in his gifts and blessings. It is doubtful any of us will face life and death decisions over righteousness, but we do face situations every day where we can say yes to God or yes to ourselves. Now, some will be big decisions. Most will be small. And while we are free from the curse of sin and death by our faith in Jesus, sin still separates us from our closeness to God. The hope that builds with perseverance comes from holding on to the promises the Lord gives to us when we are right with him. Now, Daniel experienced the bounty of spiritual blessings because of his faithfulness. In the next chapter, that faithfulness will take Daniel to the throne room of the king. Well, that gets us through the first chapter of Daniel and in the Discovering Daniel. I appreciate you guys coming to Blue Faith Podcast. If you guys have any questions, stop by and visit with me. Take care.